Hi everyone, my name's Nasa. Welcome to the Generalistic Practice Social Work Podcast, and today we are going to be talking about the social exchange theory. So, the social exchange theory was basically created to explain the rationality of human behavior. Basically, what that means, it was kind of a concept created to explain, like, why do people make the decisions that they do. And it was founded in the 1950s by George Hammonds, and he really focused on the behavioral aspect. So his idea was really about, like, why socially do people believe the way that they believe. So Hammonds kind of believed that behaviors of people are dependent on rewards and costs of their relationship. So basically, he thought that people engaged in certain social decisions and they assess the cost and the benefit of those decisions. So one example of that might be, like, I'm in a room full of people that I don't know. The reward of me talking to people is that I make some new friends, and the cost is maybe some embarrassment or humiliation if those conversations don't go well. So he also coined the term the principle of least interest theory. So it's basically the idea that the person, if we're talking about a relationship, the person with least interest in the relationship holds more power because they are least dependent on it. So if you're thinking about social interactions and relationship with people, if you are kind of the person who doesn't really care about the outcome, then you have more power in the relationship because you don't have as much costs or you don't have as much to lose. So that's kind of where what George Hammond contributed to the theory. He really, like I said, focused on the behavioral aspect. It's not just in, like, one-to-one relationships. It could be like why somebody made the decision to pursue higher education, even though it costs a lot. So maybe they thought that the rewards was if they had a degree, the costs don't matter. But George Hammonds focused a lot on, like, the behavioral aspect. 10 years later, John Thibault and Harold Kelly kind of furthered the social exchange theory, and they really focused on the concept of relationships, so how people mutually talk and interact with each other. They discovered, like, kind of like a subsection of the social exchange theory called the interdependence theory, which is like partners have mutual influence on each other in relationships. So now that we talked about background, now that we talked about kind of where it shows up, how it's created, we'll talk about some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses. So some of the strengths of social exchange theory is that it's really logical and really straightforward. People make decisions every day, and it kind of makes the assumption that people operate off of their own best interest, and so people make decisions that are most beneficial for them. Simple, straightforward. It could also be used in so many different disciplines. So we talked about criminal justice, we talked about politics, we talked about economics. It could also be seen in, like, the hospital industry. It could be seen in anthropology. It can be in the job market, and, like, so much more. So the social exchange theory can show up in so many different industries and so many different areas, and so that makes it really strong because it supports a lot of the ways that we function in society. And I think another strength is that it considers individual and relationships, as well as, like, mutual relationships, individual behavior, mutual relationships, and just like an all-encompassing theory for the way that people kind of move through life. At the same time, there are a lot of weaknesses associated with this theory. So, some scholars argue that it focuses too much on rationality, and basically what that means is people think that this theory is too calculated. Like, it's not always the fact that people make very meticulous decisions. It's not always like people are considering the cost benefit analysis of every little decision they make. That's not always the case. Sometimes people just react very impulsively and they make decisions without really thinking about it. Or sometimes people stay in the situation even though the costs are really, really high. So an example of this is like people who choose to be in abusive relationships instead of leaving. Maybe they're making a decision to be in that relationship because of emotional attachment, but the costs are really, really high. Their health is at risk. Sometimes their finances, their independence, and all of that is at risk. So there's high costs, and it might be hard to see where the rewards lie. And then lastly, I think that this theory kind of lacks cultural frameworks. So sometimes what feels appropriate in one culture might not be appropriate in another one. So it's hard to decipher like what aspects are really costs and what are really rewards, and it really varies different from people to people, and across cultures. So that's something that it's very broad, and I think it's a little too broad. Sometimes it doesn't consider the complexity of like the human experiences and how your background, where you're from, has a lot to do with your decision making. So at this point, we talked about strengths and weaknesses, we talked about background, we talked about where it shows up, and we're going to talk about implications for social work. So I think this is a theory that can be used in social work a lot. It could be help you understand clients' decision making, especially when certain choices feel irrational. It's a good opportunity for professionals to kind of assess a client and where they're at with a specific situation. It's also an opportunity to build like trusting relationships. So like if you can kind of understand why people make the decisions that they make, they might feel more comfortable opening up. It could be used as a tool to empower clients, help them understand more about themselves, like what are their motivators, what are some of their stressors, and help them navigate decision makings. It can help with advocacy. So maybe a client needs all the information to make an informed decision and they don't have it, and so maybe they're making a decision without having enough details, and that's where a social worker can really help with that advocacy piece and helping helping clients understand the full scope of what they need to make a decision on so that they can do that. And I think it could also help explain family dynamics, like why do you feel the way you feel about the relations that you have with siblings, with parents, with moms, and again, that fosters those relationships between client and social worker. And then I think it can be used in crisis work, which is where I've seen this a lot. And somebody who works in a domestic violence unit, sometimes it helps explain when it's important to help a client consider seeking safety versus the cost of leaving domestic relationships. So I'm thinking like, let's say somebody wants to leave a situation because their safety is at risk, but also you have to consider like the fear, instability, and where they're gonna go if they decide to leave, lack of protective factors. Do they have enough people and support systems to count on? Does it make sense for them to make that move in that specific moment? So I think it shows up a lot in crisis work. And then for me, I'll end off by saying like I hope to use this theory in practice because and I think that it would help me build resilience. So thinking about myself and self-care and recognizing like the cost versus rewards of doing social work, and like trying to understand like when the work is causing me things like compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, or vicarious transformation. if I'm experiencing those things and I feel like the costs are really, really high, when to implement more self-care so that I can continue to do the work, so that it feels rewarding and fulfilling for me. So reassessing kind of where I need to move and maneuver. Um, but yeah, I think that the social exchange theory is a great theory. It shows up in so many aspects of our lives. I think almost everyone can have a relationship to it, and I think that it's a really useful and practical tool to be using and discussing in class. So thank you so much for listening. Yeah.